The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of diesel exhaust, cheap cigars, and the sweet, cloying smell of desperation. It was the summer of '76, and the mood was electric. Corn was over $3 a bushel, beans were pushing $7, and every farmer with a pulse and a half-decent line of credit was looking to get bigger. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant was the heartbeat of it all, a siren song luring men to gamble their futures on another 80 acres, another bigger plow, another tractor with more horsepower than sense. I stood near the back, my arms crossed over my chest, my knuckles stained with grease that no amount of lava soap could ever fully scrub away. My name is Jack Miller. I was farming the same quarter section my grandfather had broken with a team of mules, the same land my father had nurtured with a Farmall M he'd bought new after the war. The dirt ran in my veins, but debt did not. The farm was mine, free and clear, a legacy of sweat and caution my father had left me along with his well-worn tools and a simple piece of advice. If you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it. In 1976, that kind of thinking made you an antique, a relic. The man of the hour, the man everyone was watching, was Dale Peterson. Dale's farm bordered mine to the west. We'd grown up together, but that's where the similarities ended. While I was patching tires on my John Deere 4020, Dale was at the bank signing papers for a brand new International Harvester 1066, complete with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a radio. While I was rebuilding the carburetor on my '65 Ford grain truck, he was driving a shiny new Lincoln Continental. He farmed with the bank's money, and in the booming mid-'70s, the bank was more than happy to give it to him. He saw me and sauntered over, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was flanked by a couple of other young lions, all of them smelling of fresh debt and ambition. "Well, well, if it ain't Miller," Dale drawled, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. "Come to pick up a few spare bolts? Or maybe you're looking for a good used push mower to handle that little garden patch of yours?" His buddies chuckled. I just gave him a slow, steady look. "Came to watch the show, Dale. Always entertaining to see men spending money they don't have." His grin tightened. "It's called investment, Jack. Progress. You ought to try it sometime. That old 4020 of yours is a museum piece. You can't make money turning a wrench half the day." Before I could reply, the auctioneer, a portly man named Bill Haynes, directed everyone's attention to the end of the line. A flatbed truck had just rumbled in, carrying the ugliest piece of machinery I had ever seen. It was an articulated four-wheel drive tractor, but it looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a river. The paint, what was left of it, was a faded industrial yellow, but mostly it was a patchwork of rust, primer, and bare pitted steel. One of the massive 18.4-34 tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old boot. The cab was a crude, boxy affair with half the glass missing. "All right, boys, here's a special one." Bill Haynes boomed into his microphone, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the obvious. Fresh from the back lot of the old Higgins Implement dealership, it's a versatile 145. She ain't pretty, but she's got a big Cummins V8 under that hood. A real puller for the man who ain't afraid of a little work. A wave of snickers and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "A little work?" someone shouted. "You'd need a tetanus shot just to touch it." Dale Peterson let out a theatrical laugh. "A junkyard queen? They should be paying someone to haul that thing away for scrap." But I wasn't laughing. I was looking. I walked closer, ignoring the jeers. I saw past the rust and the neglect. The frame was massive, built from thick plate steel. The planetary hubs were enormous, overbuilt for a tractor of its size. The design was brutally simple, all heavy-duty mechanical linkages instead of the complex hydraulics and electronics that were starting to appear on the new models. It was built like a bulldozer. It was honest. I peered into the engine bay. There it was, covered in a thick layer of grime and bird droppings. A Cummins V555, the triple nickel, a big, naturally aspirated V8 diesel. They were known for being thirsty and loud, but also for being tough as nails. I checked the oil on the dipstick. It was black as tar, but it was there. The engine wasn't seized. "What do you see in that pile of junk, Miller?" Dale sneered, coming up behind me. "Dreaming of all the time you could waste fixing it." I ignored him and walked back to my spot as the bidding started. "All right, who'll give me $1,000 for it?" Haynes pleaded. $1,000 for a four-wheel drive. Silence. 500. Come on, boys. The scrap man will give me that. $500. More silence, punctuated by a few coughs. Dale was loving it, his face glowing with smug satisfaction. All right, $100. Who'll start it at 100? I raised a single finger. Haynes's eyes lit up. I got 100 from Jack Miller. Now 2. Who'll go 200? The crowd was dead quiet. They were all looking at me like I'd grown a second head. Dale was shaking his head in mock pity. Sold, Haynes slammed his hand down, for $100 to Jack Miller. Son, you just bought yourself a project. As the crowd moved on to the next item, a shiny John Deere chisel plow that started a furious bidding war between Dale and another farmer, I walked over to pay the cashier. The weight of their judgment was a physical thing, a heavy blanket of scorn. They saw a fool buying a pile of rust. I saw a chance to get the horsepower I needed to compete, but to do it on my own terms. Without a banker's signature, without a payment book. I spent the next 2 days getting the beast home. It took a friend with a winch truck and a lowboy trailer, a case of beer and a lot of swearing. We dragged it into my machine shed, the one my dad and I had built with our own hands. It looked even worse under the bare light bulbs, leaking fluids from half a dozen places onto the concrete floor. Sarah, my wife, came out from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the tractor, then at me, her expression a mixture of concern and unwavering faith. Well, she said softly, you certainly got your $100 worth. I just smiled. We'll see, honey. We'll see. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat on an overturned bucket, just looking at it. The sheer scale of the task was daunting. Every hose was rotten, every wire was frayed. The engine would need a complete teardown. The transmission was a mystery. The hubs and differentials were probably full of water. It was a mountain of work. But as I sat there in the quiet of my own shed, on my own land, I felt a sense of peace. This was my mountain to climb. The money was spent. The steel was mine. Whatever happened next, the outcome rested solely on my 2 hands. Now, before we get into the grease and grime of this rebuild, I gotta ask you folks listening, have you ever taken a gamble on something old and rusted? Something everyone else called junk, just because you saw the good bones underneath? Maybe it was a car, a tool, a piece of equipment. Drop a comment and let me know what it was. I'd love to hear about it. Because every man who's ever turned a wrench knows that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones you have to bring back to life yourself. The rebuild of the Versatile became my obsession. It consumed my nights and my weekends through the fall and into the bitter cold of winter. My days were for the farm, maintaining the other equipment, hauling the last of the corn to the elevator, planning for next spring. But when the sun went down and Sarah had settled in for the evening, I'd head out to the shed, flip on the lights, and enter a world of steel, oil, and stubborn bolts. The first order of business was the engine. The Cummins V555 was a monster, and getting it out was a battle. I used a heavy A-frame hoist my dad had welded together years ago, its chain groaning under the weight. Once it was on the engine stand, the teardown began. It was like an archaeological dig. Every layer of grime told a story of neglect. The valve covers were dented, the intake manifold caked with a mixture of dirt and oil that had turned to concrete. I worked methodically. I laid each part out on a clean workbench, labeling bolts and brackets in old coffee cans. The heads came off with the help of a 4-foot breaker bar, the bolts screaming in protest. The news wasn't good. There was a visible ridge at the top of the cylinders, and 2 of the pistons showed signs of scoring. The crankshaft bearings were shot. It needed a full overhaul. Parts were the next challenge. A new rebuild kit from Cummins would cost more than a decent used tractor. So I became a scavenger. I spent hours on the phone, calling every salvage yard in a 3-state radius. I found a set of standard bore pistons from a wrecked road tractor in Missouri. I located a good used crankshaft at a yard in Iowa that specialized in heavy truck parts. The owner, a grizzled old man named Gus, took a liking to my story. "You're rebuilding a 145, he'd rasped over the phone. "With a triple nickel. Son, you're either brave or a damn fool." "Probably a bit of both," I admitted. Well, I like a fool with ambition, he'd chuckled. I'll make you a good price on that crank. Just promise me you'll send me a picture when you get that old girl breathing fire again. The Block and Heads went to a machine shop in the city, an old-school place where the owner still did the work himself. He hot-tanked them, magna-fluxed for cracks, bored the Block 30 over, and did a valve job on the heads. It cost me a good chunk of my savings from the year's crop, but it was the only way. You can't build a house on a rotten foundation. While the engine was away, I attacked the rest of the tractor. I drained the differentials and planetary hubs. Just as I'd suspected, the fluid that came out was a milky brown sludge, more water than oil. I tore each hub down, a greasy, back-breaking job. The bearings were rusted, the seals were gone. More phone calls, more trips to parts stores, more evenings spent pressing in new bearing races with a block of wood and a heavy sledgehammer. Community scorn was a constant low-grade hum in the background of my life. When I went to the co-op for feed, I'd hear the whispers. Hear Jack Miller's trying to build a tractor out of scrap parts. Yeah, poor guy. His dad was a smart farmer. Guess the apple fell far from the tree. Dale Peterson was the most vocal. He'd make a point to drive his new pickup down my lane, slowing down as he passed the shed. I'd see his silhouette in the cab, shaking his head. One Saturday he stopped while I was wrestling one of the giant tires back onto its rim, using nothing but 2 tire irons and a lot of sweat. "Still playing with your toys, Miller?" he yelled from his truck window. I grunted, heaving the last bit of the bead over the rim. "It's keeping me out of the bars, Dale." "You know, the bank's got a great financing program on right now," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You could have a new Steiger in your yard by Monday. Real horsepower. Not this project. This project will be paid for, Dale. That's the only kind of horsepower I'm interested in." He just laughed, a short, sharp bark, and peeled out, spitting gravel behind him. Even Mr. Abernathy, the president of the local bank, paid me a visit. He showed up one afternoon in his crisp suit and shiny shoes, looking entirely out of place in my muddy farmyard. He made small talk about the weather and crop prices before getting to the point. "Jack," he said, leaning against the fender of my Ford truck, "I admire your resourcefulness. I truly do. Your father was a valued customer, but we're in a new era of farming. To stay profitable, you have to expand, you have to modernize. A man can't do that with cash alone. We have loan packages designed for young farmers like you. We could have you in a new 150 horsepower tractor with a full warranty for a very reasonable payment." "And what's the interest rate on that reasonable payment, Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag. He shifted his weight. "Well, rates are a bit high right now, with inflation, probably around 9–10%. "I see," I said. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll stick to my plan." He sighed, a look of genuine pity on his face. "You're limiting your potential, son. Dale Peterson understands. He's going to double his acreage this year. That's the way to get ahead." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's the way to get in over your head." He left and I went back to work, the conversation leaving a sour taste in my mouth. The pressure was immense. It wasn't just about the tractor anymore, it was about defending a philosophy, a way of life my father had taught me. Every rusted bolt I broke loose, every new seal I tapped into place was an act of defiance. The hardest part was the toll it took on my time. Spring was coming fast. I was spending so much time in the shed that my field prep was falling behind. I had to get the corn stalks chopped and the ground chiseled. My 4020, as reliable as it was just a 2-wheel drive. On the wet clay hillsides, it would spin and struggle. I was burning twice the fuel and taking twice the time it would have taken with a 4-wheel drive. I'd come into the house late at night, exhausted and smelling of gear oil, and see the worry in Sarah's eyes. She never complained, but I knew she was hearing the talk in town, feeling the pressure just as much as I was. One night in late March, I hit a wall. I was trying to time the Cummins engine, a notoriously tricky job, and I couldn't get it right. I was tired, frustrated, and my hands were numb from the cold. I threw my wrench across the shed, where it clattered against the metal wall. I slumped down on the cold concrete, my head in my hands. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I should just call the scrap man and go to the bank, hat in hand. The weight of it all felt crushing. The whole world was moving one way, and I was trying to paddle a canoe against a tidal wave. The years between 1977 and 1979 were like a fever dream for American agriculture. The world wanted our grain, and prices stayed high. Land values, which had already been climbing, went ballistic. It seemed like every farmer was an expert investor, and every acre was a gold mine. The mantra from the universities and the government was clear: plant fence row to fence row. The talk at the coffee shop wasn't about the weather anymore. It was about interest rates, leverage, and cash flow. It was a golden era, and Dale Peterson was its golden boy. He became a local legend. He bought another 320 acres at a price that made old-timers gasp, financing nearly all of it. He traded in his 1066 for a brand-new, top-of-the-line Steiger Panther III, a green monster of a tractor with jewels all around and more lights than a runway. It cost more than my entire farm was worth. He built a new Morton machine shed that dwarfed my barn and put up a grain leg with 2 massive storage bins. The bank, led by an ever-smiling Mr. Abernathy, seemed happy to print money for him. Dale was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman. He drove with an air of invincibility, the king of a rapidly expanding empire built on soaring commodity prices and cheap, easy credit. Meanwhile, I finally brought my own monster to life. In the spring of '77, after that one night of despair, I'd gone back into the shed the next morning, picked up my wrench, and got the Cummins timed perfectly. With Sarah's help, I wrestled the engine back into the frame. I spent a week plumbing the fuel lines, wiring the gauges, and filling the fluids. The day I first tried to start it is seared into my memory. I bled the fuel system, took a deep breath, and hit the starter button. The big V8 turned over slowly, then faster, and then erupted with a deafening roar and a huge cloud of black smoke that filled the shed. It sounded raw, powerful, and angry. It sounded alive. The old Versatile wasn't pretty. I'd given it a coat of rust-oleum red primer to stop the corrosion, but it was still a patchwork of dents and welds. The cab was noisy, rattled like a can of bolts, and had no air conditioning. But when I put it in gear and let out the clutch, it pulled my 24-foot field cultivator through the tough clay soil without even breathing hard. The Cummins bellowed its deep-throated song, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was ahead of the game. With the 4-wheel drive, I could work my ground more efficiently than ever before. I could get into the fields earlier in the spring and work later in the fall. I was covering more acres per hour, burning less fuel per acre, and putting less wear on my other equipment. I was farming my land, my paid-for land, better than my father ever could have. But in the eyes of the community, I was a failure. They saw Dale's shiny new equipment, his expanding acreage, his new truck, and they saw success. They looked at my primer red, home-built tractor, my modest 160 acres, and my 10-year-old Ford pickup, and they saw a man who had missed the boat. They saw a man clinging to the past, too scared or too stubborn to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. The whispers at the co-op didn't stop, they just changed their tune. It wasn't about me being a fool anymore. Now it was about me being a failure. Poor Jack, they'd say. He could have been somebody. His farm is the same size it was when his dad died. No ambition. Dale's pity turned to open contempt. He'd pass me on the road, his big Steiger dwarfing my Versatile, and he wouldn't even wave. He saw me as an irrelevant relic, a footnote in his own grand story of success. I ignored it all. I stuck to my father's plan. The good years came, and the money was better than it had ever been. But instead of running to the bank for more loans, I did the opposite. I took the profits and I battened down the hatches. I paid off my operating note from the year before within 30 days of harvest. I built up a healthy savings account. I put a new steel roof on the barn and the house, paying the contractor in cash. I bought a used John Deere 7700 combine, not the newest or the biggest, but a solid, reliable machine. And I paid for it with a single check. Every dollar I earned went into strengthening my foundation, not expanding my fences. Sarah and I lived simply. We didn't take fancy vacations or buy new cars. We were building a fortress, brick by paid-for brick, while everyone else was building castles of cards. I knew it couldn't last. No boom ever does. The signs were subtle at first, little whispers on the financial news I listened to on the radio while I worked in the shed at night. A new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. Talk of taming inflation and monetary discipline. The prime interest rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, started to tick up. 8%, 10, 12. The numbers were so abstract they didn't seem real. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was finishing up disking the last of my corn stubble. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy smell of newly turned soil. The Cummins in the old Versatile was humming its steady, rhythmic beat, a sound I had come to associate with security, with ownership. It was the sound of paid-for steel. Across the fence line on Dale Peterson's land, a different scene was playing out. The brilliant halogen lights of his new Steiger cut through the twilight, illuminating a massive cloud of dust as he tore through his fields with a new, wider disc. His pace was frantic, desperate. He was working late every night, pushing his new equipment to its absolute limit. I could hear the high-pitched whine of its turbocharger even from half a mile away. It was the sound of horsepower, all right, but it was also the sound of a massive bank loan. It was the sound of borrowed money burning diesel at 20 gallons an hour. A cold wind swept across my fields, rustling the dry stalks left in the rows. It felt different from the usual autumn breeze. It carried a chill that went deeper than the temperature, a sense of foreboding that settled heavy in my gut. I throttled down the Cummins, letting its rumble settle into a low idle, and I watched the lights of Dale's tractor moving back and forth in the darkness. He was farming in a different world than I was. A world of big numbers, big risks, and big payments. And I had a terrible feeling that his world was about to come crashing down. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a banker's letter, but as a silent, brazen sky. The spring of 1980 was dry. The rains that should have come in April and May to soften the soil and coax the newly planted corn from the earth never materialized. The sky remained a vast, indifferent sheet of pale blue, day after day. By June, the young corn plants were stunted, their leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture they held. The ground turned to concrete, and deep cracks snaked across the fields. My old Versatile, with its massive tires and heavy frame, could still pull the planter through the hard ground, but it was slow going. The Cummins V8 bellowed its protest, its temperature gauge climbing higher than I liked. But it never stopped. Every evening I'd check the fluids, grease the fittings, and tighten any loose bolts. It was a simple, honest machine. Its needs were basic: clean fuel, clean oil, and a man's attention. Across the fence, Dale Peterson was fighting a different kind of war. His new Steiger had more than enough power to handle the conditions, but it was a more delicate beast. One afternoon, I saw it sitting idle in the middle of his field, a green island in a sea of brown dust. An hour later, the dealership's service truck was there. I learned later at the co-op that a hydraulic control valve had failed. It was a small computerized component, no bigger than a man's fist, but it had paralyzed the entire 300-horsepower machine. The part wasn't in stock. It had to be ordered from the factory in Fargo. For 4 critical planting days, Dale's million-dollar operation was brought to a standstill by a $50 part he couldn't get his hands on. He paced the fence line like a caged animal, his face a mask of frustration, while my old ugly tractor chugged along, row after row. The drought was only the beginning. That summer, the news on the radio was filled with talk of a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. It was a political move, something to do with a place called Afghanistan. But for us, it was a body blow. The export market, the very engine of the 1970s boom, slammed shut. Corn prices, which had been hovering around $3, began to slide. By harvest time, they were struggling to stay above $2.50. The harvest was a grim affair. The yields were down by a third due to the drought, and the price we got for what little we had was collapsing. It was a brutal 1-2 punch. For me, it was a bad year. My savings took a hit, and the new roof on the barn felt like a luxury I might regret. But my land was paid for. My equipment was mine. The only person I owed was myself. For Dale, it was the beginning of a catastrophe. His entire business model was built on high yields and high prices. His loan payments to Mr. Abernathy were calculated based on $3 corn, not $2 corn. The first cracks in his empire began to show. He traded his new Lincoln for a used Ford pickup. He let go of his one hired hand. The frantic late-night work in the fields stopped. Sometimes I'd see his big Steiger parked in the shed for days at a time, silent and dark. The fuel tanks on his farm, once always full, were often empty. The steady stream of delivery trucks to his new grain bins slowed to a trickle. The whispers in town changed again. The awe was gone, replaced by a nervous, morbid curiosity. Heard the bank had to extend Dale's operating note, one farmer would say to another over coffee. Heard he missed a payment on that Steiger. The final nail was driven by a man in Washington. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war against inflation, cranked interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen. The prime rate, which had been under 10% when Dale signed his papers, soared to 15, then 18, then past 20%. His loans were on a variable rate. It was a detail hidden in the fine print, a clause that seemed insignificant during the good times. Now it was a guillotine. The cost of his debt was doubling, even tripling, at the exact same moment his income was cut in half. One cold November afternoon, I saw Mr. Abernathy's sedan pull into Dale's driveway. He wasn't smiling this time. He stayed for a long time. When he left, Dale didn't come out of the house. The lights in his new machine shed, which used to burn brightly every night, stayed off. The silence from across the fence was no longer just the absence of noise, it was the sound of a dream dying. The winter of 1981 descended on Henderson County like a shroud. The cold was bitter and unrelenting, but it was the economic chill that truly froze the spirit of the community. The farm crisis was no longer a headline on the evening news. It was a palpable presence. It sat in the empty chairs at the coffee shop, in the hushed, anxious conversations at the feed mill, and in the growing number of auction notices tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse. They called them dispersal sales, a clinical, sterile term for the public dismantling of a family's life and legacy. Every sale was the same. A crowd of somber-faced farmers would gather, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their expressions a mixture of pity for their neighbor and a cold fear that they might be next. They weren't there to find bargains. They were there to bear witness, to pay their last respects. The auctioneers, who had been the booming voices of optimism just a few years prior, now spoke in a more subdued, almost apologetic tone. Dale Peterson's sale was scheduled for a Saturday in early March. The sky was the color of lead, and a raw wind whipped across the barren fields, carrying flurries of snow that stung the skin. I went, not out of any sense of triumph, but because it felt like the right thing to do. I parked my old truck down the road and walked up the long driveway, past the new house that was now owned by the bank. The scene was devastating. His entire operation, the envy of the county, was lined up in neat rows in the yard, each piece tagged with a number. The Steiger Panther, its green paint already starting to fade, looked like a magnificent beast waiting for the slaughter. The massive disc, the 24-row planter, the grain trucks, it was all there. It was a monument to an ambition that had been crushed by circumstances no one could have predicted. Dale was standing near the machine shed, a hollowed-out version of the man I once knew. His shoulders were slumped, his face was gaunt, and the cocksure grin was gone, replaced by a vacant stare. He looked right through me, his eyes not registering who I was. Mr. Abernathy was there too, standing off to the side with a couple of other men in suits, his face a professional, unreadable mask. He was just doing his job. I watched as the Steiger went up on the block. The auctioneer started the bidding at $100,000, a fraction of its original price. The crowd was silent. He dropped it to 90, then 80. Finally, a dealer from 2 states away got it for $72,000. I thought about the pride on Dale's face the day it was delivered, and a knot tightened in my stomach. While everyone was focused on the big-ticket items, I wandered over to the smaller equipment. Tucked behind the shed was a set of old tire chains for a 2-wheel drive tractor, the kind that would fit my 4020. I needed a set for pulling the manure spreader in the mud of early spring. When they came up for auction, the bidding was slow. I got them for $20. I paid the cashier with a worn bill from my pocket. It was the only thing I bought. As I was loading the heavy chains into the back of my pickup, a voice came from behind me. "Find yourself a bargain, Miller." I turned. It was Dale. He looked a little more present, a flicker of awareness in his eyes. "Needed some chains," I said quietly. "Sorry about all this, Dale." He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Yeah, me too. You were right, you know, all those years ago at that first auction. I called you a fool." He kicked at a frozen clod of dirt. "Paid for steel. That's what you said. You had it right all along. I built a house of cards on borrowed ground, and the first strong wind blew it all away." He looked over at my old Versatile, which I had driven to the sale, parked discreetly down the road. Its primer red paint was ugly, but it stood there solid and unassuming. "That old Junkyard queen," he murmured. "She's still running good?" "Runs like a top," I said. "The Cummins is noisy, but it always starts." He just nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a ghost at his own funeral. That spring, I farmed my land and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The crisis was still raging. 2 more of my neighbors went under before planting season was over. But my farm was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. When I needed fuel, I paid for it with cash. When I needed seed, I wrote a check that I knew would clear. My 4020, with its new-to-me tire chains, handled the spreader with ease. The Versatile pulled the field cultivator, its engine rumbling with the same steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that reassured me with every pass across the field. I wasn't getting rich, but I was surviving. I was holding on to what my father and grandfather had built. In the heart of the worst agricultural depression since the 1930s, that was more than enough. It was everything. The aftermath of the crisis was a long, slow healing process. The land didn't care about interest rates or foreclosure notices. It still needed to be worked. The seasons still turned, and for those of us who had managed to hang on, there was work to be done. A few weeks after his sale, I heard that Dale and his family had moved into a small rental house in town. His wife had taken a job as a checker at the grocery store. Dale, I was told, was just adrift. I thought about him a lot. I thought about the boy I'd played baseball with before the ambition and the easy credit had twisted him into someone else. One morning, I drove into town and found him. He was sitting on a park bench across from the courthouse, just staring at the traffic. He'd lost more weight, and his eyes had the dull, defeated look of a man who had forgotten which way was up. I sat down next to him. We didn't speak for a few minutes. "Planting season's coming up," I finally said. He grunted, not looking at me. "Not for me." "I could use a hand," I said. "The Versatile is a lot of tractor to handle alone, and I want to get the corn in early this year. I can't pay much, but it's honest work." He turned his head and looked at me for the first time. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, searching for pity or gloating. He found neither. "Why?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Why would you help me?" "Because you're one of the best operators in this county," I said, and it was the truth. "And because my dad always said you never kick a man when he's down." He looked away toward the fields on the edge of town. He was quiet for a long time. "When do you want me to start?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dale worked for me that spring. It was awkward at first. He climbed into the cab of my old Versatile, a machine he had once openly mocked, and his hands, which were used to the joystick and digital displays of a Steiger, had to relearn the simple, heavy levers and stiff pedals of the old tractor. But he was a natural. He drove with a precision and care that was beautiful to watch. He treated my equipment like it was his own. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the weather, about soil conditions, about getting the seed depth just right. We were just 2 farmers, working the land together. That summer, the bank put his old farm up for sale. The 320 acres he had bought at the peak of the boom were now being offered for less than half of what he'd paid. I went to see Mr. Abernathy. I walked into the bank not as a man asking for a favor, but as an investor. I had my savings, my financial records showing years of profitability, and a solid plan. I made an offer on the 80 acres that bordered my home place, the piece of ground I had looked at my entire life. My offer was low, but it was all cash. In an economy where banks were desperate to get toxic assets off their books, cash was king. Mr. Abernathy, the man who had once pitied my lack of vision, looked at my proposal and accepted it on the spot. I took possession of the land that fall. Dale helped me plough it. The first time we took the Versatile and my big moldboard plough across the property line, turning over soil that was now mine, neither of us said a word. But we both understood the weight of the moment. Life went on. Dale eventually got back on his feet. He took a job managing the local co-op, and he was good at it. His first-hand experience of the boom and bust gave him a wisdom that other farmers respected. We became friends, a quiet, unspoken friendship forged in the crucible of failure and forgiveness. Years passed. My son, Tom, grew up. I taught him how to farm, not just the mechanics of it, but the philosophy. I taught him how to listen to an engine, how to read the soil, and how to tell the difference between an investment and a gamble. I taught him that the goal wasn't to be the biggest farmer in the county, but to be one of the farmers still standing in 50 years. One sunny afternoon, when Tom was about 16, we were in the old machine shed, getting the planter ready. He was working on one of the row units, and I was greasing the fittings on the old Versatile. It wasn't our main tractor anymore. I'd since bought a newer, more comfortable four-wheel drive, but I could never bring myself to sell it. It sat in the corner of the shed, a monument of primer red steel. "Dad," Tom said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, "why do we still have this old thing? It's ugly and loud, and it doesn't even have a radio." I smiled and patted the tractor's massive fender. "This old thing," I said, "is the reason we still have everything else." I told him the whole story. I told him about the auction in '76, the whispers and the ridicule. I told him about Dale Peterson's shiny new tractors and his empire of debt. I told him about the dry years and the high interest rates and the long, lonely nights I'd spent in this very shed, covered in grease, bringing this machine back from the dead. "This tractor," I said, my voice growing quiet, "taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how much you can borrow, it's about how much you own. It's about building on a foundation of rock, not sand. We call it paid for steel. It means that when the storms come, and they always come, you'll have something solid to hold on to." Tom looked at the old Versatile, his eyes seeing it for the first time, not as a piece of junk, but as a symbol. He ran his hand over the rough, dented hood where the name Cummins was still faintly visible. He nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning on his young face. I looked around the shed, at the tools my father had passed down to me, at the land stretching out beyond the open doors, and at my son, the future of it all. The boom and the bust were over. The noise had faded. What remained was the land, the family, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the surest path forward is the one that respects the lessons of the past. The old Cummins V8 sat silent, but its story, the story of survival, echoed louder than any engine ever could.